Welcome to the Deathcast.
Our special segment tonight is a fresh look at the series of murders in Atlanta. Aaron Jackson Jr. was among the youngest, only 9 years old. Funeral services were held today for 15-year-old Joseph Bell, the 24th victim in Atlanta's child slayings.
It's just a tragic, horrible nightmare that we're going through.
In Atlanta, another body was discovered today, the 23rd. Larry Rogers, a 21-year-old black man, last seen getting into a green car near his home March 30th. Ruby Jeter was 14. We're not in a position today to make an arrest. Timothy Hill, 13. Patrick Baltazar, 11.
There are cases in history that have gone on much longer than this has.
For almost 2 years, the bodies have kept coming out of Atlanta's rivers and woods. The killer? There was a handful of sketches, no one the same, no one certain to be the person police want.
She also claims that the killer, who is black and used to live in Miami, says that he delivered some of the children to whites to be killed.
They don't know how or where or even how many of the black victims may have been killed by the same person. At Police Task Force headquarters, there are 27 faces on the wall, 26 murdered, 1 missing.
Wayne Williams' attorneys asked the court for any prosecution evidence that might clear him. The prosecution said there was none. Judge Clarence Cooper agreed to study everything the prosecution had. 2 months later, after personally reviewing files of the Special Police Task Force, Judge Cooper turned over volumes of material to the defense. Nowhere was there any mention of an investigation into possible Ku Klux Klan involvement in the murders. But 9 months before, a handful of Atlanta police officers and GBI agents had begun a top-secret Klan probe known as the 8100 file. According to the file, then GBI Director Phil Peters ordered it kept secret, even from the task force, for fear that, quote, if the intelligence leaked out, it would possibly cause a race riot, end quote.
A half dozen of the cases may be isolated, unrelated homicides, the victims found near home, killed perhaps by family or friends. But somewhere in the city of Atlanta, there is a person who has killed 15 or 20 boys and young men.
With my theory, the person is not abducted, not kidnapped, not snatched off the street at that particular time, but is willingly going with somebody for something, at least at the instance they get in the car.
Larry Marshall, convicted in the past of robbery, forgery, and running a house of prostitution, lived in this house in the backyard of downtown Atlanta. For several weeks, undercover FBI agents and police have been watching the house and this one a few blocks away. Both reportedly have been hangouts for young teenage boys who police think came here to exchange sex with men for money.
Ruby Jeter was 14.
Children he's seen in the neighborhood. Among them, 13-year-old Timothy Hill, 11-year-old Patrick Baltazar, and 15-year-old Joseph Bell. 62-year-old Tom Terrell, who has been convicted 4 times of sex offenses. On March 12th, the day before he was reported missing, Timothy Hill spent the night at Terrell's house.
You was here on 12th, going to school to come back on the 13th. That was my birthday.
They didn't come back.
He been back, yeah. If he did, I didn't see him. And haven't seen him since.
Last week, Timothy Hill's body was recovered from a river. He was murder victim number 21. Tom Terrell is being questioned by police. Lee Brown, head of the Special Task Force, denies that sex is a significant factor in the child murders.
Hello again, and welcome to the Deathcast. I am your host, best-selling independent author Ian Totten. I'd like to thank you for joining me as we prepare to take our 6th and final look at the Atlanta child murders of 1979 to 1981. Before we dive into it, as always, I have my normal plugs. If you'd like to follow me on social media, you can find me on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and MeWe, all under Ian Totten Author. If you'd like to help support the show, you can find me on Patreon under Ian Totten Author. There's, I believe, 3 tiers up right now, with content going up sporadically at this point, although I am hoping to be getting it up in a more straightforward fashion here in the not-too-distant future. At this point, the main thing is that episodes are going up before they are officially released. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe and leave a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app. It really does help the show. Now that the plugs are out of the way, get yourself something to drink, sit back in a chair, relax, close your eyes. I have my coffee, I have my cigarettes. Let's go into the crypt. When we left off last week, the Muse Media in Atlanta was camped out in front of the Williams household. This was after the police announced that they had questioned an individual who they did not consider a suspect, and although at first the media did not release this individual's name, on some newscasts they did give Wayne Williams' name. And they also found out that he had been stopped getting onto the highway after a supposed splash had been heard underneath the Jackson Parkway Bridge in the Chattahoochee River. And Wayne Williams brought a lot of this media attention on himself by holding he called it a press conference. It was really more of an interview. This was on July 4th, where he stated that, he was a suspect. To this day, Wayne Williams maintains his innocence in all of the murders, which leaves us to wonder, if he really was innocent, why would he bring that attention on himself? And I'm speculating here, like a lot of people, Wayne Williams wanted to be famous, and I suspect that he did the things that he did because he believed somewhere in his 23-year-old mind that once all the smoke cleared from the suspicions that he was involved in the murders, he would some way be able to spin this 5 minutes of celebrity into a career in show business. And there is some evidence to support this idea of mine, notably in the way Wayne Williams carried himself before the cameras and in the tape-recorded interview that he did. He comes off as a very cocksure young man, a hip music impresario that was a real mover and shaker, which wasn't the truth in any regard. Yes, he was trying to be, a music manager and get this group that he called Gemini up and running. But from all indications, it didn't appear that he'd had much success with that yet. At this point in his life, his real job was as an independent photographer. He's basically an ambulance chaser. He would sit in his car listening to the police scanner, and when a call would go out, he would rush to the scene and attempt to take pictures of whatever it was that had taken place, and then attempt to sell the pictures as well as any footage he might have taken to the news stations in the area. And his father, Homer, did this as well. And the reason that his father did this was because the family had gone bankrupt back in around 1976 or so they really needed to have cash coming in. So it's not surprising that Williams was trying to turn this whole media circus to his advantage. However, he painted himself into a number of corners. Specifically, he let the media know that the FBI had informed him that the answers he had given on his polygraph were deceptive. He also grossly exaggerated, who and what he was, misrepresented himself via his resume, which he handed out to the reporters that came for his press conference. After he gave his interview and the media didn't leave, the family kind of hunkered down inside their house. And on a number of occasions, Williams or his father would come out and go into the backyard, and the media would be all over it, or if they went out the front door, they'd be all over it. And at one point, he is seen yelling at them and telling them to leave him alone. This despite the fact that he's the one that had alerted them to his identification and in fact invited them into his life. An interesting aspect that really isn't mentioned much is that apparently Wayne Williams sat down with a reporter his father knew, and the man had made a tape of Wayne Williams that Wayne insisted would clear him of the murders. This reporter took the tape, and later, when the defense attempted to get hold of it, the news station that the reporter worked for refused to give it up. At one point during this stakeout, Williams is known to have led police on something of a chase in his station wagon, driving first to Maynard Jackson's home and then Lee Brown, who was the head of the task force. Another story is that Homer Williams had actually gone to Charlie Brown Airport ostensibly to inquire about chartering a plane to South America. Williams later said that this was a joke that the family had concocted in order to try and relieve some of the stress that they were under, which, as you can imagine, was considerable considering the fact that their only child had outed himself as the main suspect in a string of murders that had held the city in both fear and enraptured. The police, for their part, were debating what they should do because they really didn't have enough evidence to officially charge Wayne Williams in the Atlanta child murders. But on the other hand, they were facing a lot of pressure from both the communities they served as well as from the federal government. This is best illustrated in the fact that Vice President at the time, George Bush, actually came down to Atlanta to meet with city leaders and offer assistance in solving the spate of killings. That should also give you an idea of how big this game had become, that the Vice President of the United States was sent down from Washington to get involved. So because of all of this political pressure, a special secret meeting was convened on June 19th at the Georgia Governor's Mansion in Atlanta that involved federal, state, and local law enforcement officials. It's been said that the head of the local FBI, as well as acting U.S. Attorney Dorothy Kirkley, pressed for an immediate prosecution. This, as they said, that it was very possible that Wayne Williams might elude the surveillance teams and slip out of town. It was also stated that if the city of Atlanta did not move forward with a prosecution, the governor may intervene and appoint a special prosecutor. On Sunday, June 21st, Wayne Bertram Williams was arrested and charged with the murder of 27-year-old Nathaniel Carter. He was incarcerated at the Fulton County Jail without bail. Initially, the police refused to give a statement as to why they had waited so long to arrest Williams, as opposed to on June 4th when he had initially been questioned by the FBI the second time. And Brown further stated that they'd only made an arrest in one of the murders, which gives the indication that they didn't suspect that Wayne Williams was responsible for any of the others. So, at Wayne Williams' preliminary hearing, it was stated that fibers found in Nathaniel Carter's hair were microscopically indifferent from ones that were found on a carpet inside Wayne Williams' bedroom. And this here is really the crux of everything involving Wayne Williams and the Atlanta child murders, because the prosecution's entire case rested on the fact that fibers similar to the ones taken from Wayne Williams' home were found on some of the victims. This is why he was charged and eventually convicted of 2, but 10 other cases were allowed to be introduced at court as pattern cases. And we're going to get into the fiber evidence here shortly. Also at this preliminary hearing, a city councilman is quoted as telling a reporter that the state's evidence against Wayne Williams was awfully flimsy and that he had thought they actually had something. On July 17th of 1981, Wayne Williams was officially indicted on 2 counts of murder, one for Nathaniel Carter, the other for 21-year-old Jimmy Ray Payne. And it's interesting to note with Jimmy Ray Payne that his death was originally not classified as a murder. So it almost seems as though the prosecutors for the state were throwing whatever they could find at the wall and hoping that something would stick. And this was a tactic that would take place throughout the remainder of Wayne Williams' trial. When the trial of Wayne Williams did eventually begin in late 1981, he was represented by Mary Welcome and Al Binder. And right from the get-go, there were issues with the trial. The judge had placed a gag order on everyone involved with the trial. However, it was repeatedly flaunted by both newspaper reporters as well as people working for and with the prosecution, which meant in effect that, there were leaks to the media that were never followed up on by the judge, who could, if he had so chosen to, declared a mistrial at any point. But it wasn't only the prosecution that flouted this order. Mary Welcome herself, on a number of occasions, was observed by Al Binder at their offices engaged in meetings with the press, which apparently infuriated Binder. There were a number of hurdles that Williams' defense had to clear in order to be able to get him found not guilty. One of the biggest, however, was the lie detector tests that had been administered to him by the FBI. Normally, lie detector tests are inadmissible in court as courts see them as unreliable. However, Wayne Williams, when he held his press conference on June 4th, had gone ahead and admitted publicly that not only had he taken a lie detector test for the FBI, but he had also supposedly failed it. And because he made this statement publicly, it was allowed into the court record, as it was seen as a public declaration by the accused. Another major obstacle for them was the fact that Williams had stated during this press conference that the FBI had accused him on the night that he was pulled over, leaving the bridge from where the splash had been heard, of killing Nathaniel Carter. The problem with this, however, is the fact that at that point, no one in law enforcement knew that Nathaniel Carter was either missing or dead. And obviously, the problems with this were that it actually implicated Williams in having some foreknowledge of the crimes, because the law enforcement didn't know about them. So it was seen as, Williams was either misremembering what was said to him, or he'd had a Freudian slip during the news conference and revealed his hand and let the press know that he did know about Carter being murdered. Now, the crux of the state's case against Williams was fiber evidence, and according to the prosecution, in materials that they had provided to the defense, 22 victims had fibers which connected them to Wayne Williams. 5 victims did not have fibers that connected them to Williams. 1 individual was still missing. Now, the defense had to find experts who would refute this evidence, but they also had to, talk with witnesses as far as members who were on the Atlanta Police Department. The Atlanta Police Department, however, did not cooperate, and anytime they went to talk with an officer, Atlanta police were, unable to find the individual, which left the defense ill-prepared in some respects for this trial. In fact, later on in the trial, when the defense complained that the prosecution had not turned over all of the evidence that it had been requested be turned over to them, the judge himself went through the evidence that the prosecution had and turned over massive binders of information to the defense that the prosecution said did not exist. So I think it's pretty evident that they were playing dirty pool right from the get-go as far as the case against Wayne Williams is concerned. There was a lot of political pressure, and then, the prosecution was not cooperating with the defense. And it could be that the prosecution realized they did not have a strong enough case to go forward with Williams, and were therefore leaving him an out were he to be convicted by saying, hey, they did not give us all the things we needed, ergo we could not put on a proper defense, and that would allow them to get the case overturned and a new trial ordered. However, that is not what happened. As Wayne Williams' trial date drew near, through the fall and into the winter of 1981, the media in Atlanta was in a frenzy, reporting how Williams was on trial in the murders of 20-some-odd youths. And this was a misrepresentation of the fact that has continued to this day. Wayne Williams was never tried for any of the child murders. He was tried for the murders of 2 fully grown adult men. And through this trial, they cleared the rest of the Atlanta child killings, despite having very little and extremely flimsy evidence to clear them or even convict him on the actual charges that he was facing. Another misconception that was perpetrated by the media was that the murders had stopped with the arrest of Wayne Williams, when in reality, after the arrest of Wayne Williams, murders continued, bodies were still found in the Chattahoochee River and still in the geographic area where other bodies had been found. What stopped, however, is that police stopped considering them as being part of the Atlanta missing and murdered case. Jury selection was completed on January 5th. The composition of the jury was 9 women and 3 men, with 8 blacks sitting on the jury and 4 whites. Opening arguments began on January 5th, and the prosecution started off by going over how the body of Jimmy Ray Payne was found, while the defense decided to go along the tract of someone like Wayne Williams being raised the way he had been could not possibly be a killer. Really not the way they should have gone. They should have gone the tract of Wayne Williams didn't do these things, and here is why. The state's evidence will not support the story they're going to paint for you. There were a lot of contentious moments during the trial where the prosecution tried to slip things into the case that the judge had prohibited, and the defense would call them on it, and either the judge would tell the jury to disbar what they had just heard, or he would allow it. The defense also was unsuccessful in stopping the prosecution from sidestepping the judge's orders on a couple of different aspects of the case in which they were able to get evidence from cases other than the 10 that the judge was allowing in to show a pattern. The majority of the case, however, hung on fiber evidence, and if you've watched any of the documentaries on this case, the way they paint the fiber analysts is that they're nearly infallible in their work, and that they were able to prove with 100% certainty, almost as though it were DNA, that these fibers came from Wayne Williams' house. This is a far cry from reality. Shows like CSI and all these other television shows like to paint the same picture. In 1982, fiber analysis was not what it would become, and it was not considered an exact science. In fact, some prosecutors considered fiber analysis as being fallible, and the reality is, in the Wayne Williams case, it was fallible, because they contended that basically this one trilobal carpet fiber could only be found in around 80 rooms in the Atlanta area. And they tried to paint the picture that this was a very rare fiber. The problem with that, however, is that the carpet that was in the Williams home from which this fiber came from is not the only type of carpet that this company sold that contained that specific fiber. This company furnished printouts to the defense showing that that specific fiber was in a number of different carpets, as well as the fact that they had sold a excessively large amount of these other types of carpets. So for the prosecution to state then and to state now that inconclusively to nothing the fibers came from Williams' carpet is a misnomer, meaning it is not true, because there was evidence that pointed away from Wayne Williams' carpet, in that other places, specifically commercial applications, existed. But the defense did not bring this up at trial. And I say this because there were a lot of instances during Wayne Williams' trial, I'm not going to get into all of them, where the defense had a very obvious opportunity to either refute the testimony of a given witness or poke holes in the things that they were saying, but they chose not to. Something else that happened in the trial of Wayne Williams is that repeatedly witnesses gave misstatements for the prosecution, one of which was Lee Brown, who was the head of the task force. They had a large mock-up of the Chattahoochee River and surrounding areas, and under questioning, Brown was repeatedly unable to show on this mock-up where certain things had taken place, where bodies had been found. All of the things pertinent to this case, he was unable to show these things to the jury. So, despite the fact that he was an unreliable witness, he was never called on this. And the state contends to this day that they, had an open and shut, airtight case. It was not so. One thing that the state was not able to prove, however, is transfer of fibers from the victims to the Williams household, which is where they contend that the victims were kept and then murdered. And the way transfer works is some particles from subject A get onto subject B when they interact, but some particles from subject B also transfer back onto subject A. They were not able to find any particles from the victims inside the Williams household. And if they did, they never made this known to anyone in court, or not made it known publicly either. Something else that was left to stand in court concerned one of the Williams' vehicles, not the station wagon that Wayne Williams was driving when he was pulled over after the bridge incident, but one they'd had prior to that, and I talked about that in an earlier episode. But just to rehash it very quickly, the state contended that Williams was in possession of a very specific cart during a period of time when the murders took place, and that fibers from this car were found on the victims. The problem with that, however, is that records indicate that the Williams did not have possession of this car. At one period during the murders, the car was in the shop because they were having problems with it. The Williamses then got it back during a period when murders were not known to have been taking place, only for Homer Williams to return the car to the dealership yet again because it was still having problems, at which time he sold this vehicle and the family got another one. Again, this was left to stand in court that the Williams owned this car and that it was involved in these murders, when records show that it was not. On Monday, March 22nd, 1982, Wayne Williams took the stand in his own defense, which, if you ask any defense attorney, they will tell you it is never a good idea for a defendant to take the stand in their own defense, because that opens them up to questioning from the prosecution whether they committed the crime or not. And prosecutors have a habit of throwing curveballs at defendants and getting them all jumbled up on the stand so that they come across as elusive and aloof to the jury. When asked if he had ever taken a human life, Williams said, "I haven't killed nobody." He also stated, "I haven't thought about it and don't plan on think about even doing it to nobody." Williams admitted on the stand that he had never choked anyone, stabbed anyone, or used a rope to take the life of another human being. He had also admitted to Al Binder that he was scared, which, given the circumstances, is completely plausible because he was literally fighting for his life. When asked if he had any grudges against anyone on the prosecution, Williams stated that he did not, as he knew that they were only doing their jobs, but he would not have invited any of them home for dinner. When questioned about the events of May 22nd, 1981, Williams stated he was going 20, 25, maybe 30, 35 miles per hour when he crossed the Jackson Parkway Bridge. I don't know. But it wasn't no 3, 4, or 15 miles an hour, I know that. And this is important to note because they did tests of the bridge. Remember, it had that large metal plate on it. And despite their best efforts, they were never able to not get that metal plate to clunk when a car went over it. Something that the prosecution contends Williams was able to miraculously do. When Williams finished for the day, apparently Mary Welcome told him he had been too lighthearted on the stand. So the next day when he was under cross-examination, Wayne was quite a bit more combative. At one point, stating to his questioner, "Sir, I am as guilty as you are." Williams would explain his trip that night, stating he did not stop at the liquor store right there off of the bridge, but in fact had gone further down the road to a convenience store to pick up boxes for his mother, which he claimed were in the car when police searched it, although police made no mention of these boxes. And really, at least in my opinion, Wayne Williams comes off as a scared 20-something-year-old who is having his exaggerations thrown back at him by a prosecutor, and not knowing any better to say, I just exaggerated on that because I was trying to make myself seem more important than I actually was. He instead would blow up at the prosecutor and, argue back with him, which is exactly what the prosecution wanted, because at the end of the day, Wayne Williams no longer looked like the mild-mannered, extremely smart, young, black, aspiring entrepreneur. He looked like an individual with a bit of a temper, who had an attitude that was completely in contrast to what he had been portraying. And this is why defense attorneys don't want their clients to take the stand. Despite what the media tries to portray it as, it's this awful, horrible thing, why wouldn't they want to defend themselves in court? A good example of that is the cop who was just convicted for the George Floyd murder. They made a big deal of the fact that he would not take the stand, when the reality is the burden of proof lies on the state, not on the defense. The state has to prove that this crime took place, that this person did it, this is why they did it, this is how they did it. The defense only has to disprove what the state is saying, and putting their defendant on the stand allows the prosecution to attack their character, get them all riled up, and, basically make an ass of themselves. There are very few cases of a defendant actually taking the stand where it turned out good for the defense in the end. So keep that in mind the next time someone is going off about a defendant not taking the stand, and they're going on about how well, they should want to clear their name. I don't understand why they wouldn't. They don't have to clear their name. They're innocent until proven guilty. And being placed in a high-stress situation where somebody is throwing trick questions at you and asking the same thing over and over and over again in different fashions is very stressful and very discombobulating. And it is very easy for a defendant, whether they are guilty or innocent, to mix up their words on a stand because of the way these questions are presented and say something that they did not mean to say or come across in a manner that they didn't necessarily mean to come across as, and therefore paint a very bad picture to the jury. Because, you see, you make a misstep when you're on the stand, the prosecution is not going to point that out and help you correct it. They're going to let what you've just said stand in the court record, and unfortunately, the defense usually doesn't get a chance to redress the witness. And therein lies one of the problems with our criminal justice system, in that the prosecution gets multiple chances to prove their case while the defense does not. By the third day of testimony, Williams had become much more aggressive, referring to Prosecutor Mallard as a fool and a drop shot. He described the FBI agents as two of the main goons. By the time Williams' testimony was finished, as I stated, he looked absolutely horrible. He looked like a very egotistical, raving madman. During closing arguments, Williams was described by Jack Mallard for the prosecution as a mad dog killer, a pathological liar with a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde personality who lived in a dream world and killed over and over without any apparent motive. Mallard went on the first day he was a calm, cool, deliberate witness. What happened on the second day, he was a completely opposite person. He showed the other side of him. He showed contempt for everyone. He showed a raging explosion inside of him. Which again goes back to my earlier point of why they don't let defendants generally take the stand, because the prosecutors are trying to work them up to the point that they will explode and will make themselves look bad in front of the jury. The prosecution also admitted that their case against Williams was largely circumstantial, which, to be honest, is how most cases are decided. It's not, unless there is absolute concrete proof, videotape footage of the guy bashing somebody's head in with a hammer or something where you can clearly see the perpetrator's face. For the most part, when somebody is at trial and they get convicted on, murder charges and what have you, most of the evidence is circumstantial. That is changing slightly with DNA evidence now being a part of courtroom proceedings, but even still, circumstantial evidence is, by and large, a major portion of a court case. As for the defense, Mary Welcome pretty much rambled on for longer than she was supposed to, trying to implore the jurors by saying Wayne is young, gifted, and black. Mr. Mallard says he was a dreamer, while Martin Luther King Jr. was a dreamer. Whereas Binder used a bridge mock-up his wife had made and supported by what he called the pillars of the state's case. After attacking each one of these pillars, he would knock it down. When the last pillar had fallen, the bridge itself collapsed, leaving behind a small sign that read "Reasonable Doubt." He went on, dragging Williams up to the stand in front of the jury, stating this pudgy, fat little boy wasn't strong enough to dispose of two victims' bodies, as the prosecutors contend. Black men of Mr. Carter's and Mr. Payne's ages are still being murdered in this community. Before diving into the fact that the body of Patman Rogers was found in a river before the prosecutors contended that the pattern had shifted and the killer began placing them into the water. And this stunned the prosecutors because they did not consider Patman Rogers to be part of the cases on the list. After bringing up the fact that the Williamses did not own the red Ford LTD at the time of certain murders, therefore the fibers could not have come from the car, the state on redress changed their story, whereas earlier they had tried to say that the fibers were shown to have come from no other car but this one, instead stating that we have never contended in this case that the fibers from the trunk liner on Charles Steffens have had to have come from a 1969 to 79 Ford LTD. What we contended was that it was consistent with having come from a Ford product, therefore blowing their fiber evidence on that case out of the water, because Williamses had no Fords in their possession during that time period that were built between 69 and 79. Basically, what they were trying to do was to change the facts to fit their case, as opposed to changing their case to fit the facts. On the afternoon of Friday, February 26th, the case was put to the jury. They worked the rest of that night and through the following day into the evening as they attempted to reach a verdict. In the end, Wayne Williams was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison. To this day, Williams contends that he did not commit any of the murders. In recent years, he has started to tell a very outlandish story. Remember, I had said that Williams was a bit of a braggart and liked to make things up. The story he is telling now is that he had been part of a secret CIA program where he was trained as an assassin. And I'm not making this stuff up, folks. You can go online and find interviews with him where he actually states this. And that the reason he was to take the fall for the Atlanta child murders was because he had gone overseas and been involved in all these political machinations back in the mid to late 70s. And that when he was pulled over that night after leaving the bridge, and that his name was flagged in the computers as they ran him, it was decided at the highest levels of the government that he was too dangerous of an individual to be allowed to walk the streets, and therefore they would have to sacrifice him in order to silence him. Again, I'm not making any of this stuff up. It's absolute, complete, and utter bullshit. I'm all for a good conspiracy theory, but to think that, a 16, 17-year-old high school kid would be secretly recruited CIA in order to perform clandestine assassinations overseas in areas of Africa is absolutely ludicrous. And to think that Wayne Williams, who, should you see him, he's a short little dorky looking guy, would be this assassin is even more ludicrous. As for the Atlanta child murders, as I stated, murders continued after Williams' conviction. Not children, but other adults. There's been so much attention given to this case that in 2019, the Atlanta Police Department actually reopened the cases because when Williams was convicted, the Atlanta Police Department cleared every single one of the cases on their list and attributed them to Williams, despite the fact that he was not convicted for all but the last two, which were adults. as of yet, there is no word as to what they have found, but thankfully, the head of the Atlanta Police Department stated upon reopening it that there were too many discrepancies and avenues that were not explored during the initial investigation that they could not in good conscience allow the case to stand as it was. So, should there be, future developments on this case, I will, do a special episode on it, as this, much like the West Memphis 3, is one of those cases that I am absolutely enthralled with. Now I'm going to get into my theory as to what happened in the Atlanta child murders, and I've talked about it off and on throughout the series. What I think happened in the Atlanta child murders is that there was a child sex ring operating in the area during the time. This isn't conjecture, it has been proven in case files that at least one did exist. And the important thing with all of this is that in almost every one of the cases, a white male was seen, usually in the presence of black men. Why this is important? We have David Wilcoxon, who's the man that was living across the street from the pool when one of the victims disappeared, who was discovered during the sweep for the young man. Wilcoxon was a white male, 50 years old. You also have these other two individuals that were tried right when Wilcoxon was tried and convicted. And then you have Uncle Tom Terrell, who owned the houses on Gray Street, which many of the victims were seen going in and out of. And apparently a lot of people in the neighborhood knew what was going on between Terrell, his friends, and these boys. Now, in case files, it's stated that a lot of these boys were street hustlers, which is another way for saying that they were male prostitutes. I'm sorry, if you're under the age of 17 and you are selling your body, you're not a male prostitute, you're a victim of child sexual exploitation. And as most of the individuals who were involved in this sex trafficking ring had prior records for child sexual abuse, I believe that at some point during the late 1970s, the people who were in charge of this ring decided that for whatever reason, some of the boys would have to be gotten rid of in order to keep themselves from getting into trouble, because if there is no witness, or in this case, no body that can be linked back to them, they have no case. And it might have been as simple as, the first few victims were gotten rid of because they were exploiting so many children. Some of them may have come out and attempted to blackmail the men who were abusing them, and, the men may have, gone along with it at first while they tried to figure out what to do in order to avoid prosecution before ultimately deciding on killing the children. And if you notice, going back to David Wilcoxon, after he was found out, he and his small group, the one man, had the photographs that they swore up and down were only pictures of white children. The murders escalated quickly after that, and what I think happened was the other members of this gang realized that there were pictures inside those photographs that could implicate them and link them to other children who were still alive. And as a consequence of this, I believe they started getting rid of these children at every opportunity that they could. I think that Tom Terrell was not only an abuser, but somebody who procured young boys for other people in Atlanta, possibly higher up the food chain than he was, which is why Timothy Hill was seen being picked up in a taxi cab by a man who smeared what was described as mud on his face. I don't believe Tom Terrell himself was responsible for any of the murders, but I do think he knew who was responsible for them. And I think that once he and his friends on Gray Street either started to get too much heat from their neighbors over what was going on in his house, or got tired of a particular boy, they would let their other friends know that, hey, you can have this kid, at which point the child was picked up by somebody who knew him and was then murdered. The adults who were murdered, I think, were individuals who knew too much about this ring's activities and who may have had knowledge of who was killing the children or been involved in it themselves. If you remember, every one of these individuals who was killed was said to be involved in quote-unquote homosexual activities. In this regard, it's not homosexuality, it's pedophilia. And I believe that the adults were killed because they knew this information, and these killing of adults did not start until the suspect was arrested in Connecticut, and I think that spooked the other members of the gang and made them realize that, oh shit, if this guy starts naming names, we might all be about to get into some serious trouble. We'd better take care of these individuals before it gets to that point and we can be targeted. Which leads us to Wayne Williams. I think Wayne Williams was involved in these murders, but I also think his father, Homer Williams, was involved in these murders. Remember, one of David Wilcoxon's Confederates was found with hundreds of photographs of boys. Well, who in this case were photographers? Homer Williams and his father. I think that Wayne Williams and his father were using Wayne Williams' aspirations in the music world as a means to procure boys for other members of this gang, and that it was they who were taking those photographs of the boys, which may explain why some fibers were found on a number of the victims that matched fibers in Wayne Williams' house. Is that these boys would go to Wayne Williams' house ostensibly to have an audition, and Wayne and his father would ingrain themselves in these boys' lives before introducing them to members of the gang, possibly saying that they were other producers or friends with connections who could help them with their music careers, and that Williams would then, come along and participate in the abuse that was taking place with these boys, and that Williams would use his various connections to the political machine in Atlanta, as well as the media and police forces, to kind of monitor what was going on with the case, to let the other people in this ring know if police were kind of getting onto them or had figured anything out. And I think that is why when Wayne Williams got popped on the bridge, he and his father cleaned their house out the next few days to get rid of evidence that would implicate them or others in these crimes. I think the boxes that Williams got rid of probably contained various sexual devices. I think the photographs that they destroyed were most probably pictures of these children who were known to be missing in Atlanta, as well as others. And I say this because although Williams has stated numerous times that he is into women, he has never been known to have had any type of relationship with women, only to have platonic relationships with young boys. And the reason I don't believe that Williams was taken care of by members of this group is there was enough evidence that damned Williams that the members of the group weren't worried about him spilling the beans on them, because in order to do so, he would have to admit his own guilt in these crimes. And again, there may have been some pretty powerful people involved in this series of crimes that Williams and his father were fearful of retribution from. Remember, I mentioned Jim Barnett, who was the wrestling promoter, who also had a lot of political connections. There is at least one case where an elderly white man was seen being driven by a large, burly black man when one of the victims went missing. It is not beyond the realm of possibility that an individual of Jim Barnett's power, and I want to clarify, I am not saying this individual was Jim Barnett because I have no proof to back that up, but somebody of his means and his political power could not have been involved in this thing and decided to let Wayne Williams take the fall for all of them because of how much Williams had participated in it. I also think that's why individuals like David Wilcoxon and Tom Terrell were allowed to get prison sentences as opposed to being removed, because they were so deeply embedded in this thing with the murders and the abuse and the selling of the children, that in order for them to, spill the beans, there's no prosecutor on the planet that would allow somebody who had been involved in the murders of, let's just say, 11 boys. There's no prosecutor that would allow them to take a plea bargain so that they wouldn't be prosecuted in order to get information on other individuals who were involved. So that is my theory on what really was going on in Atlanta with these murders, and unlike the prosecution's theory, there is more circumstantial evidence to back up my theory than there is to back up the case against Wayne Williams as a lone perpetrator. I know there are other theories out there involving occult involvement in the Atlanta child murders. Specifically, individuals have tried to link the Son of Sam cult to the Atlanta child murders as well as to Charles Manson's family. To me, that's just stretching all of this a bit too far. There is really no evidence that fits the crime. Whereas with the child sex ring, there is volumes of evidence that point to this is probably what happened. So that is it for the Atlanta child murders, the first story covered this season on the Deathcast. I'd like to thank you for following me down this long 6-episode series. I hope you enjoyed it. If you would like to share your thoughts on the case, theories you may have, you can find me on Facebook, MeWe, and Instagram. Just look for Ian Totten Author. I'm always up to discuss things of this nature. Again, if you enjoy the show, please consider liking, subscribing, sharing it on social media, and leaving a 5-star review wherever it is that you find your favorite podcasts. Until next week, stay morbid.
Welcome to the Deathcast.